Until I became a pastor and had to sit on this side of the chancel rail every Sunday morning, I always sang in the church choir. My dad taught me to appreciate a wide variety of music, from Handel's Messiah to Flop-Eared Mule and everything in between. So while I'm a folk musician, I do appreciate fine music. However, when it comes to performing choral music like our choir does here, I'm not exactly what you'd call gifted. I mean, I can sort of read music. I know when a note goes up and I know when it goes down. At least I know a little bit, but mostly what I sing and play is by ear. I copy what I have seen other folk musicians sing and play before. And you see, unfortunately, Vivaldi didn't write a whole lot of music for the banjo. Now, when I was in seminary in Texas, I joined the choir of the church I attended, and I met Ed. Ed sang with the Fort Worth Opera Guild. Ed sang solos in Handel's Messiah and Vivaldi's Gloria and a host of other classical pieces. And one night at choir practice, I sat next to Ed. I was amazed at how good I sounded that night. I could sing anything. I could sing it loud. So every Wednesday night at rehearsal and every Sunday morning in church, I made sure I sat next to Ed. As long as I sat next to Ed, I sounded like Luciano Pavarotti. If I wasn't sitting next to Ed, I sounded like the wind whistling through a splinter on a post. Every time I think about the power of the Holy Spirit in my life, I think about Ed. Somehow, sitting next to Ed made me a better musician in that moment than I could have been on my own. And somehow, through the alchemy of God's grace, the Holy Spirit is able to make me a better disciple than I could ever manage to be on my own. Now, I know today is not Pentecost Sunday, when we usually celebrate the coming of the Holy Spirit to the church. But on only one or two occasions in the 16 years I have been here as your senior pastor, has Pentecost Sunday not also been Confirmation Sunday. So I got all of these pent-up sermons about the Holy Spirit that I've just been dying to preach for years. So don't worry, my sermon today only lasts about 2 hours. I'm kidding. No, it lasts 3. The Hebrew word translated spirit in the Old Testament is the word ruach. But ruach can also be translated wind or breath. In the New Testament, the word most often translated as spirit is the word pneuma, which can also be translated wind. The only way, therefore, the Bible has to explain this experience for which we have no explanation is to compare it to the movement of the wind. And like the wind, God's Spirit cannot be manipulated. Oh, we can harness the Spirit's power through practices of discipleship, like Bible study and prayer and things like that, much like we harness the wind's power with a windmill, but we certainly can never control it. The book of Acts describes the coming of the Holy Spirit as the sound of a rush of a violent wind. In John chapter 3, Jesus says to Nicodemus, "The wind blows where it chooses, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit." To put it bluntly, God's Spirit doesn't follow our rules. The wind of God's Spirit doesn't consult our bylaws before blowing across our lives. As important as policies and procedures are in a church, we have to be ready for God to work outside them. As important as morals and conventional wisdom are, we have to be ready for God to circumvent them from time to time. Tony Campolo tells about the time he went to a funeral home to attend the funeral of a lady he had known all his life named Mrs. Kirkpatrick. Now, the funeral home was one of those places, I know you've been there, that can house several different funerals at the same time, and there were several going on that day. And Campolo was running late, and so he rushed into the building. He sat down in the room, and he looked over in the casket, and he noticed that the man in the casket didn't resemble Mrs. Kirkpatrick at all. And then he looked and he noticed that apart from himself, there was only an elderly lady sitting about 2 or 3 seats away from him. He was the only person there apart from her. He'd obviously gone to the wrong room. And he was just about to leave when that elderly woman reached over and grabbed him by the arm and said, "You were his friend, weren't you?" Campolo started to say, "Well, sorry, ma'am, I'm at the wrong funeral. Your husband obviously didn't have any friends." But the widow obviously needed someone to whom her husband meant something, and so he lied and said, "Yes, I knew him, and he was always kind to me." So Campolo sat with her through the funeral service. He rode with her in the one car following the hearse to the cemetery. He stood by her side at the graveside as the casket was lowered into the ground. And when they got back to the funeral home, Campolo took the widow by the hand and said, "Ms. King, I have to tell you something. I want to be your friend, and I can't be your friend after today unless I tell you the truth. I really didn't know your husband. I came to the funeral by mistake." Well, Miss King sat silently while Campolo wondered how she was going to react. And finally, after what seemed like an interminable moment, she reached out and she took Campolo's hand and said, "You'll never, ever know how much your being here with me meant to me today." God's Spirit that day was coloring outside the lines, traipsing off into uncharted territory, blowing where it chose, whether it fit into anybody's categories or not. Of course, if we think that's the way the Spirit operates all the time, then maybe we should just throw caution to the wind, right? Literally throw it to the wind of God's Spirit and allow every screwball, crackpot notion to be the will of God. I've known Christians like that. I've known churches like that. When you do that sort of thing, you wind up like the man whose wife took off with a friend of his, and he went over to talk her back into coming back home, but the other man said, "You can't have her. The Lord told me to take her away from you." And the husband replied, "Yeah? Well, I've been talking to the Lord since you have, and He told me to come over here and beat hell and guts out of you." How can we know when an idea or an action is the Holy Spirit acting outside the norm or just somebody acting like a doofus? The book of 1 John tells us to test the spirits to see whether they are from God. And the best way to test the spirits is to live with each other in community. You see, I believe the Holy Spirit is not just within us. I believe the Holy Spirit is also between us. And the more dedicated we are to being disciples together, the better we can determine where the wind of God's Spirit is moving. That list of the works of the flesh that we had a lot of fun with a minute ago, that isn't meant to be an exhaustive list. It isn't certainly not a checklist. It's simply a yardstick for a Spirit-filled bunch of disciples to test the spirits. Every action, every decision is to be measured by the life and teachings of Jesus. And in Jesus, we see characteristics like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. No wonder Paul calls them the fruits of the Spirit. The community of faith can discern if the Spirit of God is moving within a person or within a group by gauging whether or not those characteristics of Jesus are present. Now, is the process frustrating? You bet it is. Is it messy? Absolutely. Is it scary? It can be, especially if you're wearing spiritual blinders. God's Spirit moves in some odd places and at some odd times. But if we listen to the wind blowing between us, we won't miss anything God is doing. Some of you may remember the story Anthony Robinson tells about a church that had been losing members for several years, been struggling financially, struggling to keep programs afloat, and just struggling to keep morale up. And finally, someone named the elephant in the room. Is it time for us to close and disband this church? So they called a meeting of the congregation to discuss what they should do. Some of the people said things like, this church has had a wonderful life, we've accomplished a lot of good things, but everything comes to an end sooner or later. Others said, but there's still so much good that we could do, so many gifts we could still share with this community. And still others said, yeah, but wouldn't it be better to give the church a decent burial rather than sit around and watch it wither away right before our eyes? And still others said, well, with the right kind of leadership, we might be able to turn things around, so let's fire the pastor. Discussion lurched back and forth like that for some time. After a while, everybody realized all the arguments had been made, everything that needed to be said had been spoken, and they still didn't know what to do. Conversation just sort of petered out. And then someone noticed little 9-year-old Joshua sitting at the edge of the group. He'd been there through the whole meeting, but he'd not been invited to speak because he was a child. What does he know? So somebody said, Joshua, what do you think? Joshua thought for a moment, looked at the group and said, I think you're going to need the Bible, and you're going to have to be brave. And everyone knew they had just heard the voice of God. Yes, the wind of God's Spirit rustles within us, but the wind of God's Spirit blows strongest between us. Amen.